The year was 1943. German soldiers captured on the battlefields of North Africa boarded troop ships under heavy guard, their futures uncertain. Many expected brutal treatment, starvation, or even death upon reaching enemy soil. Yet as the ships drew closer to the United States, the prisoners gazed upon landscapes unlike anything they had ever imagined. Endless fields stretched to the horizon, towns glowed with electric lights even during wartime, and trains thundered past carrying goods in quantities unimaginable in Europe. The journey itself began the unraveling of illusions carefully nurtured by Nazi propaganda. The men, mostly veterans of the Afrika Korps, had been told America was weak, divided, and dependent on Jewish and immigrant labor. Instead, as they marched from train stations into makeshift camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and Iowa, they found a nation teeming with vitality. Their temporary barracks stood sturdier than the houses of many German peasants back home. There were dining halls with food in abundance, Red Cross parcels delivered regularly, and medical staff ensuring Geneva Convention standards were not only met, but exceeded. For prisoners braced for misery, it felt surreal. Halfway across this journey, let me pause for a moment. If you're drawn into this forgotten chapter of history, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because these are the hidden stories that shape the modern world. Stories rarely told in classrooms, but vital to understanding how enemies became future allies. Back in 1943, disbelief was written on the prisoners' faces. How could a nation at war still spare resources for its captives? Why would guards joke with them, treat them with dignity, and even provide English classes? For many German POWs, stepping into America was not a descent into punishment, but an awakening. They began to realize that the war they were fighting could not be won. Not against a country that could feed prisoners better than German civilians, not against a nation where factories ran day and night producing more in a week than Germany could in months. By the time the first weeks in America passed, whispers spread among the barracks. Perhaps Germany's vision of strength was an illusion, and perhaps true power looked like this: quiet, industrial, efficient, and humane. The first weeks inside American prisoner of war camps were a revelation for the captured German soldiers. Barbed wire surrounded the compounds, watchtowers stood at the corners, and guards patrolled with rifles ready. Yet what struck the prisoners most was not the security, it was the humanity. They had prepared themselves for squalor, yet the barracks were clean, heated, and built with wooden floors. Bunks were neatly arranged, each man given blankets, soap, and fresh clothing. Compared to the scarcity back in Germany, where many families rationed every ounce of coal and every loaf of bread, life here already seemed paradoxical. Meals astonished them further. 3 times a day, the chow halls served generous helpings: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and even coffee. Prisoners accustomed to thin soups and black market scraps stared at plates that rivaled peacetime feasts. Some laughed at the absurdity, others felt shame, and a few whispered anxiously that such treatment must be a trick. Could America really afford to feed its enemies so well while fighting across 2 oceans? The answer revealed itself in the sheer abundance of farmland nearby, where fields stretched farther than any German soldier had ever seen. Recreation and routine filled their days. Soccer fields were set up, orchestras formed, and church services were offered. Prisoners could even check out books, attend language classes, and participate in lectures. One POW later wrote in his diary, "We came expecting dungeons but instead found universities." The guards, often young Americans only a few years older than their captives, sometimes played games with them or exchanged cigarettes. For men raised under Nazi discipline, where contact with enemies was portrayed as impossible, this casual camaraderie was bewildering. The comparison to their homeland stung deeply. Back in Germany, bombed-out cities lay in ruins. Families survived on dwindling rations, and fuel shortages paralyzed daily life. Here in the United States, even prisoners of war slept warm, ate full, and lived orderly lives. The contrast forced many to reconsider what they had been taught. that America was weak, decadent, and unprepared. Instead, the camps became living proof of a society that thrived in war without descending into chaos. For the first time, many POWs admitted quietly to themselves, perhaps not aloud, that they were safer, healthier, and more comfortable behind enemy fences than they would have been in their own collapsing homeland. As the war dragged on, the United States faced a growing challenge. Millions of its young men were overseas in uniform, leaving farms and factories short of labor. The solution came not from recruitment posters, but from within the barbed wire fences. German prisoners of war were soon assigned to work programs that took them into the heart of American agriculture and industry. What began as necessity would evolve into one of the most profound cultural exchanges of the conflict. POWs picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and stacked hay in Kansas. In Iowa and Nebraska, they worked the vast cornfields, astonished at the scale of machinery. Tractors larger than anything they had ever seen, silos towering like castles, and rail cars moving grain in endless streams. By the war's end, German laborers had harvested nearly 939 million pounds of vegetables, a figure so staggering it left many prisoners speechless. They realized they were not just witnessing abundance but actively participating in it, helping to sustain the very war machine they had once hoped to defeat. The economics were equally staggering. Their collective work generated an estimated $230 million in value, reinforcing America's agricultural dominance. For the prisoners, accustomed to strict rationing in Germany, where even butter and eggs were luxuries, the sight of overflowing markets and steady production was almost beyond comprehension. Some wrote in letters home, carefully censored, of course, that America seemed like a land where shortages simply did not exist. This labor also brought POWs into direct contact with American civilians. Farmers drove out to the camps to collect work details, often treating the men with a surprising degree of respect. On the fields, guards relaxed their vigilance, recognizing that escape into such vast landscapes was nearly impossible. Locals sometimes shared meals with the Germans or offered small kindnesses like fresh fruit. These interactions softened hardened attitudes, revealing an America far removed from the caricature painted by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. Through sweat and soil, the POWs began to understand the real secret behind America's strength, an industrial agricultural engine so immense that even prisoners of war became a cog in its machinery. It was here, bent over rows of crops under the Midwestern sun, that many realized Germany's war was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the farms and factories of a nation that simply outproduced them on every front. Inside the camps, daily life went beyond routine labor. The United States, guided by both Geneva Convention obligations and a quiet strategy of re-education, opened doors that no German soldier had expected to walk through. What they found behind the barbed wire was not indoctrination, but exposure. Exposure to ideas, freedoms, and cultural habits that stood in stark contrast to the rigid control they had known under Hitler's Reich. Camps offered libraries stocked with English and German books, from agricultural manuals to Shakespeare. Lectures were organized by university professors and military chaplains, covering everything from American history to constitutional law. Prisoners debated these ideas freely in study groups, sometimes for hours, comparing the open exchange of thought to the censorship and surveillance they had endured back home. For soldiers raised to believe in only one truth, the Nazi truth, this atmosphere was bewildering yet liberating. Music became another bridge. Pianos, violins, and even makeshift orchestras brought together men who once marched to military bands under the swastika. Instead of rigid martial anthems, they played Mozart, Beethoven, and American folk songs. Guards sometimes joined in, laughing with the very men they were charged to watch. Such simple moments chipped away at barriers built by years of propaganda. Perhaps the most powerful lessons came through observation. German soldiers saw American guards reading newspapers filled with criticism of their own government, a concept unthinkable in Germany. They noticed that African American units, though facing discrimination, still wore the same uniform and fought under the same flag as white soldiers. This paradox of freedom and imperfection challenged them, forcing comparisons to a homeland where dissent was silenced with prison or death. Some POWs even enrolled in formal education programs created by the War Department. Courses in civics and economics emphasized democratic values, not through coercion, but by letting German officers and enlisted men engage with them intellectually. When asked later why such programs worked, one American officer explained, "We did not tell them democracy was good, we showed them how it functioned." Through books, debates, and daily interactions, German prisoners experienced democracy not as a lecture, but as a lived reality. Slowly, minds began to shift. They came to see that freedom of thought was not weakness, but strength. And in this revelation lay the seeds of transformation, an enemy army quietly becoming witnesses to a system stronger than any weapon on the battlefield. As work programs expanded, German POWs increasingly stepped outside the confines of the wire. American farmers, factory owners, and local families began to interact with them directly, and what started as necessity soon blossomed into something more: human connection. These encounters broke down stereotypes on both sides, revealing unexpected common ground between sworn enemies. In rural communities, prisoners often became part of the harvest season. Farmers would drive them to fields at dawn, provide meals at midday, and share stories over supper before returning them to camp in the evening. Many Germans were stunned that civilians, whose sons and husbands were fighting overseas, treated them with kindness rather than bitterness. In letters later written home, censored though they were, POWs described Americans as hard-working, hospitable, and astonishingly prosperous. Some confessed that they were treated better in the United States than their families were back in bomb-shattered Germany. Communities also discovered something surprising. The prisoners were not monsters. They were young men, many just in their 20s, who loved music, soccer, and joking as much as any American. Cultural exchanges began almost naturally. Town bands invited German musicians to join rehearsals. Local churches welcomed prisoners to Christmas services, where carols were sung in 2 languages. On rare occasions, dances were held where townspeople and prisoners mingled under careful watch, moments that lingered in memory long after the war ended. The effect was profound. For Americans, these interactions challenged wartime propaganda that painted Germans as uniformly fanatical Nazis. For many POWs, the warmth they received contradicted everything Joseph Goebbels had preached about America being degenerate, divided, and hostile. Here they saw decency where they expected vengeance, generosity where they anticipated cruelty. Even children played a role. In towns near camps, local kids would approach the barbed wire, curious about the enemy soldiers. They traded candy for handmade toys or practiced broken German phrases. For the prisoners, these innocent gestures pierced through years of ideological conditioning, showing them a future beyond hatred. By war's end, many POWs admitted that these bonds had changed them permanently. They no longer viewed America as an adversary, but as a society that valued dignity and opportunity. For some, the friendships formed in those fields and towns became the very reason they would one day seek to return, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. While manual labor connected German POWs to everyday American life, another program quietly reshaped their worldview: re-education. By 1944, Washington realized that simply housing prisoners was not enough. If these men were to return to Germany and rebuild a shattered nation, they needed exposure to democratic values that stood in sharp contrast to the authoritarian ideology they had been raised under. The Office of War Information, alongside the Army's Special Projects Division, launched a carefully designed initiative. At select camps, POWs were introduced to reading materials that challenged Nazi propaganda. A newspaper, Der Ruf, produced by anti-Nazi German exiles, was distributed across hundreds of camps. It highlighted democracy, human rights, and post-war reconstruction efforts, offering perspectives that would have been unthinkable in Hitler's Reich. While participation was officially voluntary, curiosity spread quickly. Within months, thousands of prisoners were engaging with these ideas. Libraries stocked with translated American classics, history books, and philosophical works became gathering points. In some camps, lectures were organized on politics, science, and literature. German officers often resisted, calling it propaganda, but younger enlisted men, many of whom had been conscripted late in the war, soaked it in. They debated freedom of speech, studied the U.S. Constitution, and compared its ideals with their experiences under the Third Reich. The most striking part of the re-education efforts was the cultural exposure beyond textbooks. In camp cinemas, POWs were shown Hollywood films, ranging from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to wartime documentaries. These movies illustrated an America far more complex and open than the caricature portrayed by Nazi propaganda. Prisoners saw vibrant towns, political debates, and even criticism of the government on screen, something unimaginable under Hitler's iron grip. Not all embraced the message. Some die-hard Nazis scoffed, dismissing the programs as shallow attempts at brainwashing. Yet reports from camp administrators noted a subtle but steady shift. Prisoners who once defended the Reich began asking questions, sometimes even openly rejecting their old beliefs. Others quietly admitted that they hoped Germany's future would resemble the democratic principles they now studied. By the time the war ended, thousands of German POWs had carried these lessons with them. For many, re-education was more than a camp activity. It became a vision of what Germany might become if freed from tyranny. Decades later, historians would trace the intellectual seeds of West Germany's democratic foundation back to those classrooms, newspapers, and screenings inside barbed wire fences in America. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, the war ended, but for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in America, a new and painful chapter was about to begin. The United States, now burdened with nearly 372,000 POWs, faced the enormous question of what to do with them. International law required their eventual repatriation, yet the timing and manner of their return carried immense political, logistical, and human consequences. At first, many prisoners assumed they would be allowed to remain in the U.S. until Europe stabilized. After all, they were working productively, filling labor shortages, and in some cases, forming close friendships with local families. But orders from Washington were firm. The POWs would be sent back across the Atlantic. For many, the news came as a devastating blow. They had tasted freedom in the form of steady meals, humane treatment, and democratic ideals, and now they were to be shipped back to a homeland in ruins. The repatriation process itself was grueling. Beginning in late 1945, prisoners were transported by train to ports like Newport News, Virginia, and New York Harbor. From there, they boarded Liberty ships or troop transports bound for Europe. The voyages were somber. Prisoners stared silently at the waves, contemplating the uncertain reception awaiting them. Would their families still be alive? Would they return to homes or to rubble? Some were not sent directly back to Germany. Instead, thousands were transferred to Britain and France, where they were used as forced laborers in reconstruction projects. These men endured years of hardship, clearing minefields, repairing roads, and rebuilding cities destroyed during the very war they had fought in. For them, release came much later, sometimes not until 1948 or beyond. Those who finally set foot in Germany were stunned by what they saw. Entire cities like Dresden and Cologne lay flattened, industries had collapsed, and food was scarce. For men who had just left the abundance of American farms and factories, the contrast was brutal. Letters from this period described the emotional shock. In America, we had bread. Here, there is only hunger, one former POW recalled. Yet the greatest pain was often emotional. Some men returned to find their families fractured, their homes gone, or their futures uncertain. Many spoke of longing for the safety and order they had known in America. The irony was bitter. After years as captives, they now felt freer behind U.S. fences than in the ruins of their homeland. While most German POWs resigned themselves to eventual repatriation, a small number chose another path. They had seen enough of America to know they could never go back willingly to a shattered Germany. Out of the 371,683 German prisoners held in the United States, only about 2,200 attempted escape during their captivity. The vast majority were quickly recaptured, often within a day, since language barriers, unfamiliar geography, and lack of support made life on the run nearly impossible. But a handful succeeded, and their stories became the stuff of legend. Among the most extraordinary cases was that of Georg Gärtner, a Wehrmacht soldier captured in North Africa in 1943. In September 1945, when the US began shipping prisoners back to Europe, Gärtner decided he would not return to the ruins of Silesia, his home province, which had been ceded to Poland under Soviet control. He feared both communist persecution and the loss of his homeland. One night, from a POW camp in Deming, New Mexico, he slipped beneath the wire and vanished into the American desert. Unlike most escapees, Gärtner did not seek immediate passage to another country. Instead, he chose to remain in the very land that had once imprisoned him. He traveled under assumed identities, drifting across the American West, working as a ski instructor, carpenter, and handyman. For decades, he lived a double life, marrying, raising a family, and blending into American society while concealing the truth about his past. The FBI and military police searched for him throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, but Gärtner proved resourceful. He avoided large German communities where he might be recognized, learned flawless English, and adapted completely to American culture. For 40 years, he remained one of the last fugitives of World War II. In 1985, long after his crime had faded into history, Gärtner stepped forward. He revealed his true identity on national television, astonishing the American public. Far from condemnation, his story was met with sympathy and curiosity. By then, Germany was a democratic ally of the United States, and his decision to remain spoke volumes about the powerful impression America had left on its wartime prisoners. Gärtner's tale embodied what many POWs privately admitted. Life in America had shown them opportunity, freedom, and prosperity far beyond anything they had known in the Reich. He had escaped not from captivity, but from the certainty of returning to a broken homeland he could no longer call his own. When the war finally ended, trains and ships carried the bulk of Germany's captured soldiers back across the Atlantic. Many returned reluctantly, stepping off in ports that led to a homeland devastated by bombing, stripped of industry, and fractured between East and West. Yet for some, departure from the United States did not mean the end of their American story. They carried with them memories of fair treatment, democratic freedoms, and opportunities they could scarcely imagine back home. A few were determined to return, not as prisoners, but as free men. In the years after 1946, roughly 5,000 former German POWs successfully immigrated legally to the United States. This was no easy feat. Immigration quotas were still in place, and public opinion remained wary of anything associated with the former enemy. But persistence, sponsors from the American families they had worked with, and the passage of post-war immigration legislation opened pathways that allowed them to resettle. Many of these men had spent long months laboring on farms, in canneries, or in lumber camps. They knew the rhythm of American life, spoke the language with growing confidence, and in some cases had formed lasting friendships with their civilian employers. Letters flowed across the Atlantic, farmers vouching for the honesty and work ethic of men who had once worn the field gray uniform. These personal endorsements became powerful testimonies that helped former POWs gain visas and green cards. The transition was remarkable. Men who had once faced American soldiers across the battlefield now stood shoulder to shoulder with them in factories, on construction sites, and in classrooms. They became engineers, carpenters, mechanics, and farmers, contributing to a society that had once been their adversary. Families were raised in small towns and suburbs, their children speaking English as a first language, with only faint echoes of their father's wartime captivity. For these men, America represented not only material abundance but a second chance. They found dignity in work, freedom in speech, and stability in communities that welcomed them not as enemies but as neighbors. Unlike the shattered streets of Cologne or Berlin, where rebuilding seemed endless, the United States offered them continuity and hope. By the 1950s and 1960s, these former POWs no longer thought of themselves as prisoners, or even as Germans alone. They became part of the American fabric, proving that bonds formed in unexpected places, in barns, fields, and factories, could outlast the very war that had brought them here. The story of German prisoners of war in the United States did not end with their repatriation, or even with those who chose to immigrate back. Its deeper significance lies in how their presence reshaped the relationship between two nations that had been bitter enemies. For the 371,683 men who lived in American camps, captivity became more than confinement. It was an unexpected classroom where they witnessed democracy in practice, prosperity achieved through industry, and humanity extended even toward foes. In the decades that followed, this experience produced ripples far larger than anyone in 1943 could have imagined. Many former POWs carried their impressions home, speaking to families, neighbors, and communities about what they had seen across the Atlantic. Their stories challenged stereotypes and sowed seeds of admiration for American ideals at a time when Germany needed models for rebuilding. Oral testimonies collected in later years revealed a striking pattern. Countless men admitted that their faith in authoritarian systems collapsed not because of Allied propaganda, but because of the stark contrast between what they had been told about America and what they saw with their own eyes. The effects reached into politics as well. Figures like Walter Hallstein, once a soldier, became central in constructing a democratic West Germany, laying groundwork for the European community. Others advocated cultural exchange programs, drawing on memories of fairness they experienced in U.S. camps. Even those who never returned to American soil spoke with respect about a nation that had defeated them in battle, but treated them with dignity in captivity. Communities across the United States also preserved the memory. In states like Texas, Nebraska, and Alabama, local museums today display artifacts, letters, and diaries from those camps. Annual reunions between former POWs and American families became symbols of reconciliation, gestures proving that shared humanity can emerge even from war's darkest chapters. Farmers who had once relied on prisoner labor later welcomed these same men back as honored guests, bridging what once seemed an unbridgeable divide. The long arc of history shows that America's most enduring victory was not only military, but moral. By demonstrating the strength of democracy through daily life rather than lectures, the United States turned enemies into advocates. What began as reluctant captivity evolved into a legacy of trust, friendship, and alliance that shaped the Cold War partnership and continues to resonate in German-American relations today.